Lavish processions, glittering jewels, palaces built for a bride. These are the images we associate with the weddings of the imperial daughters of the Ottoman Empire. But behind the silks and gold, a far more troubling story unfolded of political duty, youth pushed into marriage, and what happened when the ceremonial night ended and the real life began. Tonight, we glimpse the hidden night behind the fairy tale wedding of an Ottoman princess. What happened after the last guest left was worse than you think. First, let's talk about the spectacle. In the Ottoman court, a princess's marriage was never just a union of two people, it was an alliance, a statement of power, a tool of diplomacy. The daughter of the Sultan didn't choose her groom. She was offered to a high-ranking statesman, a vizier, a pasha, someone who could strengthen the empire. The weddings themselves were epic. We're talking months of preparation, caravans loaded with a trousseau so lavish it could bankrupt a small nation, and entire palaces constructed just for the bride. The city would light up with public parades and fireworks, a massive celebration for all to see. But from the moment the political deal was signed and the bride's dowry was announced, another, quieter truth loomed. The princess's own hopes and dreams were rarely part of the plan. And here lies one of the darkest elements of these imperial marriages, the age of the brides. Many Ottoman princesses were betrothed and even married at ages we would today consider childhood. There are documented cases where the bride was barely into her teens when the wedding was celebrated. Take the story of Kaya Sultan, daughter of the powerful Sultan Murad IV. In the early 1640s, she was married to a man in his 40s. Her age? It's estimated she was somewhere between 11 and 14 years old. While these marriages might have been symbolic at first, the reality was that this young girl was being sent to a new household, a new life, and was expected to step into adult duties long before she had even matured herself. Imagine the immense pressure and confusion of that situation. So, what actually happened on the wedding night? It was an event steeped in strict protocol. Memoirs from palace attendees describe how the bride, adorned in her finest, would be ceremoniously escorted to the bridal chamber. In some accounts, the groom himself couldn't even enter until he was escorted by the chief eunuch. Once he was inside, the doors were closed, the guests dispersed, and the couple was left alone. But this bridal chamber, even in a grand imperial palace, was far from a romantic retreat. For the young princess, it was a doorway into a new life, one defined by her status, her duties, and the heavy expectation of producing heirs. Now, while sources show that some princesses had surprising rights, like the right to delay the consummation of the marriage and to be the only wife of their husband, which was unusual in a polygamous society, the emotional and psychological weight must have been enormous. When the fanfare ended and the eunuchs withdrew, many of these young brides found themselves alone in vast, opulent palaces, the lavish wedding dress replaced by the stark reality of their new life. This is where it gets worse than you think. It wasn't just about a political union. It was about control. The imperial palace kept its princesses under strict surveillance. She wasn't a bride in the way we understand it today. She was a strategic piece on the dynastic chessboard. She was often removed from her own family, her entire social world replaced by the rigid hierarchy of the palace, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, eunuchs, and the complex protocols of her husband's world. That story about Kaya Sultan? It gets even more intense. One account claims that on her wedding night, she was so distraught that she actually assaulted her new, much older husband with a dagger. She claimed a prophecy foretold doom if the marriage was consummated and used it to assert her right to refuse. It was a desperate act of defiance in a world that gave her very little choice. In other cases, the marriage contract was completed when the princess was very young, but the consummation was delayed until she was physically mature. But whether it happened that night or years later, her life was already irrevocably changed. Even with a white dress and the sound of trumpets, the reality inside that chamber was often one of fear and a profound loss of childhood, of choice, and of family. The princess had entered a gilded cage. Despite this grim picture, it is important to remember that Ottoman imperial princesses did have some unusual rights compared to many women of their time. As we mentioned, they often had the right to be their husband's only wife, meaning he couldn't take other wives or concubines. They could also, in some cases, refuse consummation and even initiate divorce. But here's the catch: these rights existed on paper. The The life they inherited on their wedding night was still one of immense constraint. The rigid palace hierarchies didn't just disappear. The bride's personal feelings, her voice, her emotional well-being, these were rarely given center stage in the historical records. So, the worst part isn't just about the ceremony or the age of the bride. It is the stark realization that the roaring public celebrations were often a mask for a heavy private burden. The wedding night marked the beginning of a life bound not by love or freedom, but by duty. So, as we look back at these historic weddings, what can we learn? For one, that grandeur doesn't erase the human cost. Behind every procession of jewels and every firework display, there was a young woman, often just a girl, stepping into a world where her own desires were pushed to the side for the good of the empire. Secondly, this story pushes us to ask, how much power did she really have once those palace doors closed? The spectacular ceremony was for the public eye, but the private reality was often the complete opposite of freedom. Finally, when we consider the wedding night of an Ottoman princess, we're reminded that sometimes the happiest-looking moments in history hide locked doors, silent sacrifices, and immense pressure. History isn't just about the glitter. It's also about the shadows behind the gold. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell for more untold stories from the past. See you next time.